All right, good afternoon once again. My name is Douglas Ling. I'm a co-manager for Small Business Strong. We're a nonprofit organization based in Boston, but we serve all of Massachusetts. We provide free technical assistance to small businesses, and we have our business advisors with us today, Jack Clement, Chris, and Adriana Acosta. So we better wave. And you have a chance to talk to them maybe a bit later on, or if you are interested in getting more support of your business beyond this session, you're welcome to go to our website, which is www.smallbstrong.com, and you will see a link to request assistance from our advisors. I will put the link in chat also. And once you register, we'll be able to assign one of our advisors, like Jack, like Chris, like Adriana, to help you with general business questions in finance, accounting, operations, HR, marketing. Big area people have needs for. And you have up to 15 hours of our free consultation, and hopefully we can help you solve some of your issues. All right. One area we got a lot of question on is obviously legal issues, and that's why we organized today's session for you. This is co-sponsored by the City of Boston as part of their June Immigrant Business Month, and with us today is our partner from Lawyers for Civil Rights, and there is Russell Paul, who's going to lead today's session. Go ahead, Russell, introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. As Doug mentioned, my name is Russell Paul. I'm the senior BizGrow attorney at Lawyers for Civil Rights, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about what immigrant business owners might need to know when they're forming their business, when they just are starting their business, and employment law, all of those fun topics. Let me, before I get started, just share my screen so everyone can see the PowerPoint, and then we'll start moving. All right, share screen, desktop. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm Russell. I work for Lawyers for Civil Rights underneath the program, which is BizGrow. And before we get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation, just a quick thing about BizGrow, because we could be helpful to you from a legal side of things outside of the presentation as well. And so what BizGrow is a group of attorneys who help small businesses. Typically, we serve minority-owned, women-owned, immigrant-owned small businesses with their legal issues, right? We're not business planners or accountants or insurance brokers, right? There are lots of organizations like Small Business Strong, that's fantastic, who can help with those. We're lawyers, so we help on a legal side of things, right? And there's kind of three core ways that we help small businesses, right? We have clinics, workshops, and seminars in the community just like this on a variety of different topics. So if you want to hear more about contracts or intellectual property or commercial real estate or any kind of legal issue that your small business might be dealing with, we provide 1 to 2 hour Zoom workshops on those. They're all free to attend. You can sign up for our newsletter and get information about all of those. Again, they're all legal topics, but they're a good way to learn about some of the things that might affect you as a small business owner. We also do clinics, and in our clinic model, it's very similar, except we have two kind of core ways that we work in the clinics, right? The clinics are usually focused on a specific topic area, and then you sit down one-on-one with attorneys to talk about your issues, right? They're expert attorneys, say in intellectual property. You had a question on trademark, you had a question on immigration or employment. We'd have a clinic on one of those topics, and you could talk for 30 minutes or so with the attorneys And usually we partner with a firm to do those: Goodwin, Kirkland & Ellis, Ropes and Gray, all the big firms here in Boston. And, it's a great way of getting, a conversation going, right? Usually it's issue spotting, seeing, if you have a legal issue, what is your legal issue and whether attorneys can help. Hopefully, sometimes the attorneys in those 30 minutes are able to answer all of your legal questions. But if not, we have our last part of our programming, which is our legal referral program. I like to say to small businesses that my role in that part of the programming is kind of like I'm a primary care physician doctor, but for small business legal issues, right? I'm a corporate law generalist. I know a little bit about a lot of different things, so I'm able to help with, a variety of different issues and small questions. But if it's going to require a lot of in-depth work, a lot of expertise in a niche field of the law, because almost all areas of the law have some kind of very hyper-specific things that you need to deal with, I'm going to refer it out again to our partners, and we partner with all the big firms here in Boston and Rhode Island to do so. So we can provide free legal help to the small businesses that we refer out, right? They're not going to charge you anything for their services. So if you realize that you need to, create an LLC after today, or you have a legal issue going on, we'll be happy to try to provide that legal support. That is certainly not a problem at all. I'll put my email in the chat at some point when I'm done speaking, so you can get that kind of help. But that's it about BizGrow. And now to move on to what we're here to talk about, which is, as a business owner, understanding your rights and obligations. So the first thing we're going to talk about is starting a business as an immigrant, either documented, undocumented, right? We'll talk about kind of those distinctions a little bit, but for the most part, we'll talk about the legal entities and why form it, right? As a small business, you are not legally required to create any kind of legal entity. You certainly don't have to go through this process if you want to start your business. You can start your business right away. There's no problems or issues at all with that. You're certainly free to do so. You are going to be able to do everything that you want without a legal entity, but there are a lot of good reasons to do it, right? The tax burden is going to be different. Your liability concerns are going to be different. Your management can be different depending on what legal entity you pick. Some kinds of investors are going to prefer some legal entities over others. And, there's also costs and ease of convenience that you want to think about as well. And so all of those things are going to be what we kind of go through. Usually I do this presentation in about an hour and a half, so I'm trying to be speedy. It's not my strong suit. I'm long-winded, but I'm going to get through as much of it as I can. And so, just bear with me. I'll take questions at the end. So the real reason to form a legal entity, regardless of whether you're an immigrant or a business owner or not, is the liability concerns that surround running a business, right? And liability in this case is all usually about the financial responsibility, right? If there is a problem with your business, who is going to pay to resolve it? Is it going to be you as a person? Is it going to be your business? Is it going to be an employee of yours, right? All of those things you have to think about, right? Your obligations under contracts, when you sign a contract, right? Who's going to pay if the contract goes badly, right? If you have loan documents, lease agreements, right? If someone slips and falls and injures themselves and sues you, right? Who is on the hook, right? And if the business is the one that is deemed liable, who is going to pay for that financial responsibility, right? And as I said, right, you're not required to create a legal entity. You can run your business out of your home, out of a car, out of, online. There's no requirements to start a legal entity, but you're going to have a lot more risk when you do it that way, right? And so without a legal entity, without creating some kind of business entity, right, all of that liability is going to flow to everyone at the organization. If it's just you, it's going to flow directly to you, right? Which means that all of your personal assets, your home, your car, your bank account, wages from other jobs they might garnish, right, can all be taken to recover the damages that a person might have. Whereas if you create a legal entity, which is kind of the big reason to do it, right, the legal liability, right, the amount of money that someone pays, right, will usually stop at the legal entity. And kind of the easiest way to explain that is with an example, right? And so if I'm running a food business in, East Boston, and someone is right in front of my business and they slip and fall and injure themselves, and the legal, the judge determines that my business has to pay $1 million to make up for it, right? That $1 million is probably more than my business has. Say my business has, $5,000 in the bank because we're just starting out, it's new. Then the judge, right, and the legal courts will decide, okay, well, you owe $1 million, right? So if you don't have a legal entity, the person can take that $5,000 that your business has, right? And then they say, what else do you have, right? Do you have that car? Do you have a house? Do you have, a spouse that has a wage? Do you have a job outside of your small business? They're going to be able to take all of, the things that you own personally that might not have anything to do with your business, right? And that's a very unfortunate situation, right? Especially when you're just starting out. If you create a legal entity, and pretty much all of the things we're talking about after this are legal entities, right? You are going to be protected in a much better situation, right? So in that same example, someone slips, falls, I owe $1 million, right? My business has $5,000 in the bank, right? The person who won that $1 million can certainly take that $5,000. They can take any assets of the business. It's likely the business is going to have to close, which again is not what we want, right? We want all the businesses to succeed, but then the liability stops there. They can't go after your car. They can't go after your house, right? Especially if, the damages were not your fault. It was negligence, normal negligence where, you didn't sweep up that morning, but you had swept up later that night and you thought that was enough, right? If it wasn't something that was grossly negligent or specifically your fault, then they can't go after any of your other assets, right? Which is the best part about creating a legal entity. It kind of sets up a shield, a protection around your other personal assets. Now, you're obviously going to want to keep them separate so it's easier to identify, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but that's really the big reason to create a legal entity in the first place, right? Now, as I said, right, I think twice already, right? You don't have to set up a legal entity. If you do just start doing business, right, the legal system will call you something, right? The lawyers love having names for everything, right? And, they can sound very official and complicated, but they don't actually mean too much. And so what you would be if you just started your business, you just started running it without doing any legal work beforehand, would be called a sole proprietorship. And that's the default status for someone who is running a business, but has not done any legal steps to incorporate and create legal entity, right? There's no formalities required to be a sole proprietorship, so you're gonna be fine there. You're gonna want to do a business certificate or a DBA in the city or town that you're working in, but it's going to be something that is much easier to do and it's much cheaper. The business will end when the owner dies, right? So you can't leave it to your family or a spouse, right, when you die, because essentially when you're a sole proprietorship, you and your business are one and the same. There's no legal separation between the two, right? And so you can't, leave yourself to someone after you die because you are dead, right? There's no you anymore, right? There's no business anymore once you pass away. So that's another consideration to think about. And sole proprietorships are one person. If you are operating your business with a couple of other people or just one other person, it's going to be called a general partnership. And general partnerships operate in the exact same way as a sole proprietorship, but now it's a little bit riskier because anything that the business does, even things that you don't have a part in, right? One of your partners decides, oh, I'm going to sign this contract because I think it's going to be a good business deal. And it turns out to be a terrible business deal, right? But you might have more money than your partner does, right? They can go after your personal assets for those damages because, again, you don't have a legal entity. You are just running it as if you and the other person are the business, right? So the liability protections are almost non-existent. There are things that you can do to protect yourself when you don't have a legal entity like a sole proprietorship or a general partnership. The first is get insurance. You can get some business insurance for your business, right? That's always a good idea, right? That'll cover some of the risks that are associated with it. There's the Homestead Act. So if you do own a home, I think it'll cover up to $500,000 of your home, regardless of, what you have to pay it for. So they can't take your house when you register for the Homestead Act if it's under $500,000, because that's, your main source of housing, and the legal system and the courts and the state of Massachusetts and the federal government have decided that they don't want you to risk that when you're running a business. There is an advantage of being a sole proprietorship or a general partnership, and that is that you only have one level of taxation. So if you've heard of a corporation like McDonald's or Google or Microsoft, right, all of those entities have two levels of taxation, where a lot of the other entities that we'll talk about, including the sole proprietorship, have one level of taxation. And that just means that you're going to pay less. I'll talk about exactly what that means more, but essentially that's what it means. And then the only other advantage is all you need is a business certificate or a DBA with the town or city that you're living in, that you're running your business in, just so they know that you're operating in their town or city. But it's a much cheaper and a much easier formality to do besides the creation of an LLC. And the LLC is going to be typically the best legal entity for a lot of immigrant-owned businesses, mostly because of some of the particularities of things. But we'll go through what an LLC is first, right? An LLC is a limited liability company. It is probably the most flexible and dynamic and easiest entity structure to set up in Massachusetts. Some of the particularities of an LLC is that instead of being called an owner of your business, you'll be called a member. It's just, again, more legal terms for funny names, right? But you're a member of your LLC instead of an owner. LLCs can have as many members as they want, so they can go from one to infinity. There's really no limit. Most are going to have a couple at most, right? And they're going to run the business and own the business from there. It has that limited liability protection that I've been talking about, right? So when there is risk involved, it's the assets of the company that are at risk rather than the assets of all of the people who own the LLC, right? The default for an LLC is one level of taxation, which essentially means, again, right, that when your business makes, say you're a one-person LLC and your business makes $100,000 in a year, right? You would not have to pay taxes as the business. You would just say that you as a person made $100,000 that year and pay taxes on that, right? Instead of having to do both, which again is going to cost you more, but it's a benefit of being an LLC. You can elect to be taxed as a corporation, either as an S corporation or a C corporation. Usually that's not what you're going to want to do because corporations, for the most part, are doubly taxed. Again, I'll talk about that more in a second, but it's just going to cause you to have to pay more. There are some reasons to do it, especially if you want to be taxed as an S corporation. But for the most part, it's just going to cause more time and headaches for yourself, and usually going to cost you a little bit more money to get done. If you are running an LLC with someone else, right? You have another partner, which for an LLC would be another member, right? It's highly recommended to create a comprehensive operating agreement or membership agreement. They aren't required by law to do, but they're certainly a good thing. And it's basically a contract between you and the other member that explains how the business is run. What percentage of the business do you own versus what percentage of the business do they own, right? How do you make decisions? If it's going to be a 50-50 split of the business, how do you split it, split a tie, right? If you decide you don't want to do something and they do want to do it, right? It's all about trying to set the expectations, some level setting going on where you are making sure that both you and your partners and your members are all on the same page about what your business is doing, how it's going to be run, how you're going to decide big decisions and things of that nature. And, if you wanted to work with lawyers for civil rights to find lawyers, right, they'll help you create an operating agreement when they're doing the LLC documents for you. In Massachusetts, we are the most expensive state in the country to start an LLC, which surprises nobody. It's $500 here in Massachusetts. And then it is $500 a year to keep going. And that's due on the date of whenever you incorporate your LLC. So you have another $500 to pay a year from when you started. And that's every year. And, Massachusetts has some of those highest fees. And so you just have to be aware of that. And that's kind of one of the biggest downsides of an LLC. And the reason why I mentioned LLCs as being good for immigrant business owners, especially if you're undocumented, is that an owner of an LLC doesn't necessarily need to be classified as an employee of the business, right? If you are an owner and a member of your LLC, right, you can do certain things for your business, but not be classified as an employee. And if you are classified as an employee, you need to file an I-9. We'll talk a little bit about that later on, but essentially you have to verify that you have legal status in the US to be working. And if you're undocumented, you won't have that. And so if you are sure of your immigration status not changing, right, as an undocumented person, right, creating an LLC is not going to add any kind of risk necessarily to how your business is running, and you can more easily run your business that way versus other things that you might want to do, where as a corporation, which we'll talk about in a second, you would have to be an employee, right? So it's much harder to run if you're undocumented as an corporation than as an LLC, where you don't necessarily need to be an employee of the business to actually work with the business. As I was just mentioning, right, corporations are kind of the second way that a lot of small businesses start after the LLC. A corporation is what you think of when you think of big companies, the ones I mentioned earlier, right? They're a separate legal entity formed by either one person or more than one person under state law. So all the things we're talking about are state law controlled. So Massachusetts is going to run it if you decide you want to create a Massachusetts corporation. The structure of a corporation requires a couple of different things, right? You're going to need to have shareholders. Shareholders are owners in this case, right? So instead of members like an LLC, corporation has shareholders. It then has directors, which like board of directors, right, will run the long-term vision of the organization, and then the officers who run the day-to-day workings of the organization. Now, if you're just one person, you will be a shareholder, a director, and an officer. You have to give yourself all of those titles, right? It's kind of silly, but that's the way corporations work, but you're allowed to be all of those. So you can certainly be a one-person corporation, either a C or S corporation. I'll talk about the differences in a second, but there are more formalities to it, right? The kind of operating agreement that I talked about with the LLC, where it explains exactly, how you run your business. While it's not required for an LLC, it is legally required for a corporation. They call it something different. They call it bylaws, but you're legally required to have bylaws that talk about how many board members you have, how do you get rid of board members, how do you add board members, how many shareholders do you have different classes of shareholders, all of those kinds of things, which if you're just one person is going to seem like a lot more paperwork for no reason, because essentially you're going to be running everything and doing everything yourself. So it's going to be a lot more work to just run it, because you have to have all of these rules and requirements in place. The default for a corporation is 2 levels of taxation. And what this means is you're going to pay taxes twice. And I think this nice little slide here represents that. So on the left side is if you are a C corporation, which is the standard corporation. If you make $100 in a year, we use $100 because lawyers are not good with numbers. So I want to keep it nice and easy for myself, right? And so if you make $100 in a year, the corporate tax rate about 27%, right? And the federal government, the IRS, will take that off the top, and then the income that you will have made in that year is now $72, right? And 70 cents. And then you pay your standard taxes, your personal tax returns, and you say, I made $72, right? And then they'll tax that at 20%, and you'll be left with $58.16 rather than if you did an S corporation, which is a smaller kind of corporation I'll talk about in a second, or an LLC or a sole proprietorship, where you have one level of taxation. You made the $100, so the $100 flows all to you, and then you pay your personal tax returns. And so if your tax rate is 20%, you end up with $80. So you can see it's just a nice way to make more money if you are an LLC, an S corp, or a sole proprietorship. The S corporation is basically the same thing as a C corporation for state purposes, right? So you're going to have officers, you're going to have directors, you're going to have shareholders. You still need those bylaws that I was mentioning, but you are a corporation that's smaller and don't really want the tax burden of having to pay both your corporate taxes and your own personal taxes. So within 2.5 months of setting up your corporation, you can go to the IRS, right, the federal government, and say, I'd prefer to be taxed as an S corporation rather than the default, which is a C corporation. So you're saying, please don't tax me the 2 levels of tax. And they will say, yes, we will allow you to do that if you fill out the paperwork and the forms. They're not super difficult to do. And so you will essentially have pass-through taxation. And that means that the corporation itself doesn't pay taxes. It files an informational tax return. Instead, all of the money that you make goes into the dividends. And when you pay out the dividends to yourself, you're going to get taxed on that. And so that is a much better way to do things. S corporations only cost $275 to start in Massachusetts rather than $500 for the LLC. So sometimes people think of that as an alternative. There are downsides to being an S corporation. First, all S corporation shareholders, so owners, must be U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. So documented people cannot own parts of S corporations. So that's one big downside. The other is if you have family, friends in other countries who want to invest in your business, that is going to be a hard proposition to do because they can't be owners of the business. So you can't give them the same kind of investment opportunity that you would if you were an LLC and you could have them be a member, because members do not need to be U.S. citizens. They don't need to live in the U.S., right? You can certainly, start a LLC as someone who lives in another country. There's no issues there. But for an S corporation, you can't as a shareholder, right? It also means that other businesses find it harder to invest in you as well, because they have to invest in you as a person rather than as a corporation, right? Because corporations are not people, even though, sometimes the legal system pretends like they are. And so they can't be shareholders in your business as well. So it's just a little bit easier to get investment if you're an LLC rather than an S corporation. the easiest investment is usually C corporations, but if you didn't want the two levels of taxation, it's again going to be a problem here because of the cap on who can actually own parts of your business. You can only have 100 shareholders at a time, so you really can't go public. And again, it's only $275 to start and $100 a year to keep going rather than the LLC. And shareholders, again, will be considered employees of an S or a C corporation, right? And so that's just another thing to think about when you're doing it. You need to file an I-9. You'll need to have, you know, workers' compensation and disability and benefit packages for yourself as an employee, right? Some of that you can waive as being self-employed, but there are still some kind of requirements there as well. This is just a nice little summary slide of what I've been talking about. I sent Doug the copy of the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to look at this going forward. But essentially, there's kind of 4 different ways to start a business in Massachusetts that most small businesses do. A sole proprietorship, which again is just the default. It's if you don't have your own legal entity, it's the quickest to set up. It doesn't really cost anything, but you're taking the biggest risk there. The C corporation is probably the least risky because there's the most formalities, the most paperwork you have to do. It's not going to cost as much to start as an LLC, but there is going to be that more paperwork, and you are going to be required to have to pay 2 levels of taxation. The S Corp, right, obviously is kind of the middle ground between the C corporation and the LLC, but can have lots of hindrances because of the fact that shareholders can't be anyone but U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. And then the LLC, it's the quickest, the easiest to do. The form that you have to fill out is called the Certificate of Organization. It's 2 pages. It's not overly complicated. It is $500, so it's the most expensive. It's most expensive to keep going as well. But for a lot of people, it offers the easiest protections and the least paperwork at the end of the year. When you have an LLC, you have an annual report to do, which is what they charge you the $500 to do, right? And you need to keep up with that. But that's kind of really where the money is going into, you know, having to fill out that annual report. Further information about, you know, having a LLC or a C Corp or having any kind of legal entity is that there's a term for the legal system, again, more just complicated terms for no reason, and it's called piercing the corporate veil. And what piercing the corporate veil actually means is the legal system, the courts have given you liability protections, creating a shield around yourself by having an LLC, so you don't have to pay personally, it's your business paying. But when you pierce that veil, right, it's because the legal system says, okay, you've created this LLC, but you haven't done enough to show that the LLC and you as a person are different, right? You need to show us that you're treating your LLC like it's a business, like it's separate from you, or we won't believe you, right? And there are pretty easy things that you can do to protect yourself. We'll talk about a couple of the other ones in a second on the next slide. But for this one, it's about making sure it's clear who is signing documents for your business, right? Instead of just signing your name, right? You want to sign your name on behalf of your business, right? So it's clear that the LLC is contracting with, the landlord, or, for a service contract, or for whatever you're contracting for, right? It's the business, not you, right? And so for corporations, the way to do a signature block is to have the name of your business, then you sign it, and then you say what your name and title is at the business. So essentially it sounds like I am signing this on behalf of my corporation. Here is who I am, here is my name, here is my title. Same thing for an LLC. You put the name of the LLC, then you sign it, you put your name again in print, and then your title. For general partnerships or sole proprietorships, it's going to be similar, even though you're not really having those protections. You just want to make it clear and get in a good habit of having the separation there. So you put what the partnership's name is called, and then you sign it, and then you say what your title is, which is going to be a partner. You don't want to just sign it and then say you're a partner at this business, because it sounds different. It sounds like, from a legal perspective, that you're signing it and you just have this other title, but it's not the reason why you're signing it. So you just always want to, try to keep your signature blocks on any contracts like this, rather than just signing your name, because that will make it less clear to the other side and to the legal system who's actually on the hook for the contract. This is for everyone, whatever legal entity you might have, right? You're going to want to obtain a federal EIN number. An EIN number is essentially the same thing as a social security number or an ITIN number, but for your business, right? So it's a registration identification kind of number that you can get from the IRS for free. Don't go to any websites that say they'll, it costs $25 and they'll do it for fast for you. You go to the IRS website and you ask for an EIN number through that link right there, which again, Doug hopefully will be able to send the PDF version of the PowerPoint to everyone. It'll take you about 5 minutes. You just type in the information. You usually want to get your EIN number after you've created your business, just because it's similar to a social security number, right? And you can't have a social security number before the baby is born, right? That's not how the system works, right? You need to be alive before you get a social security number. Same thing with your business, right? You can do some transferring if you want to. That causes way more headaches. It's just much easier to have the LLC, the S Corp, the C Corp created, and then go to the IRS and ask them for an EIN number for that business, right? And again, it's free, it's easy, and it will help when you want to get a bank account, which is in two PowerPoint slides right there. But before that, right, you want to have a DBA, which is called a doing business as, or a business certificate. Some towns have different names for them. And essentially, that's just letting them know that you exist, right? And if you have a doing business as, you can have like a trade name, right? The actual name for your LLC is something long, and you want a shorter name to put on contracts or your website because you think it's catchier, right? You can certainly do that by having a DBA so people can figure out who is what, right? I used to work in an organization called the Lawyers Clearinghouse under Affordable Housing and Equity. Was a mouthful, and so they had a DBA to just go by Lawyers Clearinghouse, right? So they could go by that and put that on contracts rather than having to put their entire name on everything. So that's a good reason to do it as well. But you also just want to be registered in the city and town that you're headquartered in as well. As I mentioned, right, getting a bank account is a good idea. You don't want to commingle your funds because if your personal assets and the business assets look like they're the same, then it's going to be much easier to do that piercing of the corporate veil, which means that all of that liability protection that you were trying to get through your LLC will be removed from you if you don't do these things. And one of the easiest ways to get it removed is by not showing that your business and your personal assets are different, because if you don't treat them as different, the legal system won't, and they'll say, okay, well, this person is harmed. They can go after you as a person as well. Another thing to think about is sometimes you'll have to do personal guarantees. Those are usually for banks, or landlords are going to make you do that for commercial leases, and personal guarantees sometimes are unavoidable. But what they are is a personal guarantee that regardless of your legal entity, you as a human, as a person, will guarantee that this contract, this lease, this mortgage, this loan is going to be done. And so you will have to pay if there are any problems, right? And so you'll basically lose all of those liability protections again that an LLC or a corporation might get you. So it's just something to think about. Sometimes you don't have any other options and no other banks that'll work with you. There's only, a certain amount of commercial lease space available. And so sometimes you'll have to do it, but just know that what you're getting into when those kinds of things happen. Here's a link to how to form, right? You go to the Secretary of Commonwealth's office and you can try to form those. But if you want legal help to start any of these businesses, again, I put my email in the chat for you. That is it on the formation side. And so I'm going to quickly go to the employment law. I just wanted to make sure all of these things are not questions. Great. And so the basics of employment law for any business owner, but immigrant owners especially, is going to be very important, especially when you start hiring people or you have friends and family that want to work for your business. They're still going to be considered either an employee or an independent contractor, and you're going to want to know the differences between the two because you're going to have lots of different responsibilities as a business owner dealing with those things, right? And so first, employees are the default in Massachusetts. But they're also the ones that you are going to have to do the most work for. You're going to have to, verify their eligibility. You're going to have to give them benefits, right? In Massachusetts, workers are considered to be employees under the law, and it's your responsibility as the employer to prove whether a worker is not an employee. And so if they are an employee, that means you're going to need to give them at least minimum wage. You're going to have to give them overtime if they are a non-exempt worker. There are all those other employment protections, unemployment benefits, workers' compensation, HR policies that you're going to have to install. And as an employee, you're going to have an I-9, which is the employment verification system here in the US, the federal system, to make sure that people are authorized to be able to work in Massachusetts in the US. And if they're an employee, you need to fill one of those out for them. Again, the burden of proving whether a worker is an employee or not is the employer's, right? And the rules in Massachusetts are some of the strictest in the country around who can be an employee versus who can be an independent contractor. Massachusetts, the strictness means that they're more likely to be considered an employee versus an independent contractor. Even if you and the person who was working for you both want it to be an independent contract relationship, that does not matter for the law, right? There are kind of a couple of different ways that Massachusetts goes about deciding whether they're an employee or an independent contractor or not. So workers are going to be classified as employees if these couple of things are true, right? The employer has control and direction over the individual's work activities, right? So if you are telling them when to show up for work, what they're doing, how to do it, right? You have ongoing supervision, which is the next bullet point there, right? It's much more likely that they're going to be considered an employee versus an independent contractor, right? If what the worker is doing is considered to be an indispensable or regularly conducted part of your business, they're more likely to be considered an employee versus an independent contractor. And then if you provide them benefits, you're just assuming that they're going to be an employee, right? And then that presumption is going to usually hold weight in the legal system. And so you want to make sure that if they are an independent contractor, you're not giving them any kind of the benefits that you would an employee. For them to be considered an independent contractor, right? These are kind of the things that you want to do. Essentially, you don't want to control how they work. You give them an assignment. You say, do this task for me. Help me make 50 tortillas, help me, do my construction, help me, run management for this day. But it's not a, daily part of your activities, right? You just want to make sure that you're not micromanaging them. The more management and supervision and micromanagement that you have over a worker, the more likely it is they're an independent, or they're an employee versus an independent contractor, right? If they perform their work outside the usual course of your business, right? It's not something that your business is set up to do, right? If you hire a plumber or, you know, an electrician, right? And you don't have you know, a plumbing business or an electrician business, it's much more likely that they're going to be considered an independent contractor rather than an employee, because that's not what you do. It's outside of the usual course of your business. They can do, you know, if you give them discretion to do it outside of work hours, you know, when they want to do the work, right? That's more likely to be an independent contract relationship. If they have their own independent business or trade, where they perform the type of work that they're being asked to do, right? So if they're a plumber, if they're an electrician, and you hire them to do those kinds of roles, it's much more likely that they're going to be an independent contractor versus an employee here in Massachusetts. You know, it's a totality of the circumstances, you know, test, right? There's not a, this is definitely an employee, this is definitely an independent contractor relationship. But, you know, you weigh all of the factors, and if it's, you know, a close call, sometimes you want to lean towards having them be considered employees, but it's a very, you know, tricky thing. And so you might want to consider talking to an employment lawyer about that if you have any, you know, hyper-specific questions on that.
So,
Yep.
so there's a question in chat. Should the independent contractor also have insurance?
So if you're an independent contractor, you can have insurance for yourself, right? One of the things, especially a lot of construction companies do, is that they have all of their workers start in LLCs as construction workers, and then they'll not have to pay for the benefits that most employees would get. So workers' compensation insurance, you know, unemployment benefits, right? Having all of those things, they'll, you know, the larger employer will not have to deal with because they're hiring independent contractors. So usually it's better for the employer to have people as independent contractors. For the independent contractor, right? You're starting your own business as an independent contractor, as an LLC, right? It's good for you to have insurance. Some of them are required to have, you know, like in construction, are required to have, you know, workers' compensation insurance for, you know, in case someone gets injured on the job, right? They can sometimes waive that if they want because it can be expensive. It's usually better to have insurance than to not have insurance. You know, lawyers are risk adverse people. And if you're saying, should you have something that you can have? The answer is usually yes, if it protects the person more, but there is costs associated, and, you know, you always have to do that cost benefit analysis. But, you know, if you work with an independent contractor, you'll likely want them to have insurance, because if they don't, again, right, and they're just an LLC, and you know, they have to pay out, or you're supposed to pay part of what they owe, right? It can be harder to get money out of them because they might not have as much money in their business. So you might want to ask any independent contractors that you work with to have insurance and to verify that they have insurance. But sometimes they won't. And so you just have to think about those considerations as well. Going into the next thing, mindful of time, I think we should be able to finish up, is some of the forms that you have to worry about as an employer. Mostly we're just going to talk about the I-9. Again, an I-9 is the employment eligibility verification system, right? It's the way to verify and document that any employees working for your business are legally authorized to work in the US. It is something that you are required to have for all of your workers and all of your employees specifically. If the authorization, you know, you have someone has temporary work authorization, right? They're on a visa or a green card for something, and it might have an expiration date. You have to know the expiration date and re-verify upon expiration, because they can get an extension, they could have new status, right? And if they don't, and they are now undocumented, you cannot have them work for you anymore. You need to keep a record of every employee that works for you and their I-9s. And it's good to have it in a easily accessible but secure location, and you want to keep it separate from any of your other documentation, right? You don't want to have all of the I-9s in, employees, personnel files, because the federal government does audits, which it mentions in a couple of bullets, to employers every now and then, and they will ask you for information. There could be, a raid where ICE comes in and wants to, collect information from you, and any information that is stored with the I-9s will be something that they can take, right? And so you just want to keep the I-9s kind of separate and isolated from everything else, because you don't want them taking more than they absolutely need to. Keep them in a secure location because there's a lot of important personal information on them. You need to maintain them. You need to have them. And you don't need to file them anywhere. They don't go anywhere unless you're getting audited or being asked to produce them. So then you definitely need them. But otherwise, you just keep a copy of your I-9 at your place of business under lock and key in a place that doesn't have any other pertinent information. You don't need to file it with any government agency, but Homeland Security, all those people can ask you for the I-9s, and you need to have it. And you need to have an I-9 for anyone who is an employee. You do not need to have I-9s for independent contractors. But if you know that an independent contractor is not legally authorized to work in the US, you cannot hire them to work for you if you have knowledge of it. You want to be very clear, right? And when you're doing it, right, you want to, for employees, verify. But if you get any information when working with someone as an independent contractor, you want to make sure that it's very important to keep those separate and not have anyone that is not eligible to work in the US on your payroll or working for you. So, just do with that information what you will. But, you don't need to verify the information of anyone who's not an employee. So any independent contractors that work with you, any members of your organization, if you're an LLC, right, you don't need to verify their work authorization if they're not employees. So just have that information there. Last thing we'll cover is paying employees, right? So there's minimum wage here in Massachusetts. It's $15 now. As of 2023, it keeps going up, but for now it's still $15. And the tipped minimum wage is for people who make tips, right? Waitresses, waiters, all the service industries that get tips, right, is $6.75 is the minimum wage. But at the end of each shift, they need to make at least the standard minimum wage. So if their tips do not account for at least $15 by the end of their shift, based on all the tips and your minimum wage there, you're going to need to, cover the difference. So you might have to pay them more if their tips are low. So again, you want to think about that when you're paying people. These are kind of just some basics that you might want to think about when you do have employees. First, they need to receive an unpaid 30-minute meal break after 6 hours of work. You can obviously give them a paid meal break, but you're not required to. But if they work 6 hours, you need to give them at least one unpaid 30-minute meal break. Hourly employees must be paid weekly or bi-weekly. They cannot be paid monthly or bi-monthly. You can do that for some employees, which are called exempt workers, but for hourly non-exempt workers, they need to be paid weekly or bi-weekly. For non-exempt workers, people who are usually paid hourly rather than a salaried employee, you have to pay them overtime in the same pay cycle in which the overtime hours were worked, right? So if they worked extra hours in 1 week and you pay them weekly, right, you need to account for that overtime in that same week. You can't wait until you have more money to pay them, right? That's just not how the employment laws work in Massachusetts. Severance pay is not required upon termination, right? Sometimes people pay extra money to people who they're firing or letting go for severance, almost no employees get severance anymore unless they're like big executives at big companies. So you don't really need to worry about that because you don't need to pay them unless you've specified that you do. Employees are presumed to be eligible for overtime unless they're a salaried or exempt worker. The overtime rate is 1.5 times their regular pay. So it's not just like a standard pay. 1.5 times is whatever they make. 1.5 times that per hour. When you pay an employee that works more than 40 hours in a work week, the overtime exemptions can apply. And an exempt worker is usually a salaried worker, right? Who is not going to be getting overtime. They, usually are executives or high-level people at an organization. There is a minimum that they have to be making, which is $684 a week for the federal government to be considered an exempt worker. And essentially all that means is they're not going to have the overtime abilities, right? And they're not going to be paid hourly, right? They're, they can work 60 hours in a week and still make the exact same amount. They're working 20 hours a week, they're making the same amount. And again, it's usually higher ups in an organization, highly compensated staff, right? The $684, I think, equates to about $36,000 in a year, which is kind of the minimum threshold that you can do. There are some exemptions, right, from this rule, right? Teachers and things like that won't necessarily have to be exempt workers, or can be exempt even if they don't meet that threshold. But for the most part, those are going to be the rules. And so you want to, most of your employees are probably going to be non-exempt, except for high-level people. But sometimes you might want to have everyone be non-exempt, or as many people as you can be exempt, so you don't have to pay overtime. But for the most part, you're going to want to keep to what their roles and guidance are on that. I think that's it from me. I know we're running out of time.